Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we're not visiting a single empire or century, but following a plant that's outlived them all. From sacred temples in ancient India to sterile dispensaries under fluorescent light, this is the entire history of marijuana use. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. The story of marijuana's early use begins, as so many things do in recorded history, with an emperor and a list. Around 2700 BCE, the Chinese ruler and herbalist Shen Nung, the legendary divine farmer, compiled one of humanity's first medical texts. In its careful brushstrokes, ma, the Chinese word for hemp, appears beside dozens of other plants: ginseng, ginger, and tea. Shen Nung described ma as both gentle and powerful, capable of easing rheumatism, soothing pain, and helping the mind forget what it could not bear to remember. In the centuries that followed, ma would find its way into countless remedies, its seeds and leaves steeped in wine, its oils mixed with herbs. China's first physicians did not treat it as a danger to be controlled, but as a natural ally, part of the same earth that produced both illness and cure. The Chinese cultivated hemp long before they cultivated the poppy or the vine. Fields of the tall green stalks lined the river valleys, swaying beside rows of millet and barley. It served dozens of purposes at once. Its fibres became rope, cloth, and paper. Its seeds fed livestock and filled cooking pots with a nutty oil. Its leaves and resin found their way into ointments for pain and inflammation. In ancient China, the practical and the spiritual were rarely separate. The same plant that tied ships and bound books could also quiet the spirit. It was believed to open pathways between the visible and the invisible, softening the space where ancestors lingered and dreams took shape. The idea that a plant could alter perception was not frightening, it was expected. The world itself was full of transformations, and ma simply reminded people that the mind was part of that same changing pattern. Over time, Chinese healers developed a kind of dual respect for the plant. It was both a tool and a teacher. Its effects were catalogued with the same precision as its fibres were spun. Physicians observed that it could ease the pain of surgical procedures or calm the mind of the restless. Some accounts describe mixtures of hemp resin with wine to dull the senses during medical operations, the earliest echoes of anesthesia. It is unlikely these early healers thought of intoxication as indulgence. To them, it was medicine, a gift from the earth that blurred the boundary between suffering and relief. Further south, across mountains and deserts, the same plant took on an entirely different personality. In India, cannabis became sacred. Known as bhang when prepared as a drink, or ganja when smoked or pressed into resin, it was not simply medicine, it was a form of prayer. Ancient texts describe it as one of the 5 sacred plants of the gods, a gift from Shiva himself. Legend tells that when the god grew weary of the world, he sought rest beneath a tall hemp plant, ate its leaves, and found peace. Since then, devotees have offered bhang to him in ritual gratitude, believing that to share the plant's calm is to share a moment of divine clarity. The preparation of bhang became a ritual in itself, equal parts chemistry and devotion. Fresh leaves and flower heads were ground in stone mortars with a rhythmic scrape that sounded like music. The paste was then mixed with warm milk, ghee, honey or spices, pepper, clove, cardamom, until it formed a thick green liquid. It was consumed slowly, often before festivals or meditative practices, to ease the mind into stillness. For those seeking spiritual union, the sensation was not intoxication, but communion. The plant did not pull them away from reality. It allowed them to see more of it. At temple celebrations like Holi or Mahashivaratri, bang was shared freely, laughter mingling with chanting, devotion flavoured with gentle euphoria. No one thought to criminalise it. To intoxicate the senses was to acknowledge that the divine could be felt as well as worshipped. Ganja, the dried flower smoked rather than drunk, was used by wandering ascetics and mystics who renounced material wealth in search of enlightenment. They saw in cannabis a companion for solitude, a plant that encouraged reflection and surrender. Where the Chinese treated it as a medicine for the body, the Indians treated it as a medicine for the soul. Both were correct, and neither believed their relationship with the plant to be strange. To them, it was no more unnatural to alter the mind than to build a temple or sing a hymn. Beyond India, cannabis travelled with traders and nomads through Persia, Egypt, and Central Asia. In ancient Egyptian texts, it appears in ointments for inflammation and eye disease. The plant's seeds have been found in tombs beside jars of honey and linen, part of the small comforts meant to accompany the dead. In Persia, it was known to physicians and poets alike. Some used it to treat melancholy and migraines, others to sharpen thought or expand imagination. And along the Silk Road, where languages and beliefs collided, cannabis adapted effortlessly, as if fluent in every culture's dialect of longing and relief. By the time it reached the Scythian steppes, it had already learned to change form according to need. It was here, among the Scythians, that cannabis found one of its most curious roles, a bridge between life and death, the living and the departed. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described what he witnessed, or at least what he was told, about these riders of the plains. After a Scythian warrior died, his companions would build a small tent from felted wool, seal it tight, and throw hemp seeds onto hot stones inside, the tent filled with thick, fragrant smoke, the air becoming so dense that the mourners would shout with joy. Herodotus, ever cautious in his admiration, noted that the Scythians howled with pleasure as the vapour wrapped around them. It sounded to him both strange and sacred, a farewell ceremony conducted not in silence, but in haze. Imagine the scene as dusk fell over the grasslands. A few low tents glowing from within, the faint smell of earth and ash drifting in the wind. Inside, men sit cross-legged, faces damp from the heat, their bronze bracelets glinting as they feed more seed onto the stones. The smoke rises until the walls themselves seem to breathe. It clings to their hair and fur clothing, coating everything with a resinous film. They are not mourning in the way later civilizations would understand it, not with solemn hymns or carved monuments, but through immersion. To breathe the same smoke as the dead was to share one last sensation with them, to send them off surrounded by warmth, scent, and confusion. It was grief transformed into ritual, a farewell both smoky and sincere. There is no evidence that the Scythians wrote prayers or hymns. Theirs was a religion of movement and memory, expressed in the objects they left behind. Gold ornaments shaped like deer and eagles, horse gear decorated with coiled beasts, small pouches of seeds. Archaeologists have uncovered hemp residues in burial mounds, preserved by the dry soil of the steppe. In some tombs, small bronze cauldrons still carry the burnt remains of the seeds Herodotus described. The Scythians may not have understood the chemistry of intoxication, but they knew the feeling. For them, smoke was a language, a medium through which the living could touch what had slipped beyond understanding. To outsiders, it must have looked like madness, a people sweating and laughing in sealed tents, overcome by invisible spirits. To the Scythians, it was purification. They called it cleansing after burial, the smoke believed to strip away impurity and sorrow. And yet, it is hard not to detect another motive hidden beneath the ritual formality. Perhaps they simply enjoyed the warmth, the dizziness, the temporary escape from grief. The line between spirituality and pleasure has never been as clear as moralists like to think. If the Chinese used cannabis to ease the body, and the Indians used it to elevate the soul, then the Scythians used it to bridge both, a meeting point between pain and release. The Scythians were nomads, born to movement. Their entire world existed on horseback, following herds across grasslands that stretched for thousands of miles. Wherever they went, the plant went with them. Its seeds were light enough to travel tucked in pouches or caught in the fur of animals. Each time they made camp, cannabis found new soil to take root in. The smoke that rose from their funerary tents likely drifted far beyond the steppe, spreading its scent and story into neighbouring lands. Trade routes carried the seeds west toward the Black Sea and south toward Persia. The plant that once thrived quietly along riverbanks now travelled with cavalry and caravans woven into the same networks that moved salt, silk, and myth. It is tempting to imagine how quickly it spread, how easily a few pouches of seed could change the cultural weather of a continent. Traders who encountered Scythian rituals must have carried the tale home. Stories of smoke-filled tents, of laughter that sounded like chanting. In the same way that spices and metals drew the attention of merchants, the mystery of this plant would have intrigued them. Hemp was already known in parts of Europe as a useful fibre crop, but through the Scythians, it acquired a different reputation, something otherworldly, almost theatrical. Where others spun it into rope, the Scythians turned it into experience. Technically, this made them the first people to hotbox a tent. Their encounters with neighbouring cultures left behind linguistic traces. Words for hemp and cannabis travelled alongside the seeds themselves, changing shape as they crossed languages. Cannab, chanvre, canvas. Even today, the English word canvas owes its origin to the same root, a linguistic fossil from the age when hemp and cloth were inseparable. Through such small inheritances, the Scythians unknowingly shaped both the vocabulary and the habits of the Western world. For all their ferocity in battle, the Scythians were not missionaries of culture. They spread the plant not by conquest, but by proximity. A single season of trade or migration was enough to introduce cannabis to new regions, where it would settle comfortably. The steppe winds became the plant's accomplice, scattering seeds across borders that had yet to be drawn. When Greek colonists established cities along the Black Sea coast, they met Scythian traders and likely encountered their smoke-filled ceremonies. Some scholars even suggest that hemp's psychoactive use may have trickled into Greek ritual life through these exchanges, though the evidence is faint. A few charred seeds, a few surprise descriptions. Still, it is telling that Herodotus's account survives at all. For a man cataloguing the customs of the known world, the Scythian smoky farewell was strange enough to record. In these rituals, one can see the continuity between the practical and the mystical that defined the plant's early history. Cannabis had already been medicine, food, and sacrament. Now it was something else, a medium for emotion itself. When words failed, smoke spoke. The same heat that softened hemp fibre also softened grief. To breathe together inside a sealed tent was to declare that suffering could be transformed into memory, that the dead were not entirely gone if their scent lingered in the air. The practice may seem primitive to modern eyes, but it reveals something enduring. The instinct to use the natural world as a tool for meaning, to find comfort in transformation. By the time cannabis reached the great cities of the Islamic world, The Scythian tents and steppe fires were long gone. Civilization had become a network of domes, markets, and scholars' courtyards. The 9th to 13th centuries, the height of the Islamic Golden Age, saw the rise of empires that stretched from Persia to Egypt, connecting poets, scientists, and mystics under the same canopy of belief. It was an age that produced algebra, hospitals, libraries, and telescopes, and quietly, a new form of the ancient plant, hashish, the concentrated resin of cannabis flowers. When pressed and warmed, it became a dark, sticky substance that could be eaten mixed with honey or wine, or burned like incense. Where earlier generations had used the leaf or flower, the scholars and mystics of the Abbasid world discovered the essence, a more efficient route to both pleasure and contemplation. Hashish travelled easily along the trade routes of the time, caravans from Persia carrying silks, spices, and small wrapped bricks of resin that changed hands from city to city. In Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Isfahan, it appeared first in the margins, among workers, storytellers, and wandering ascetics. The plant that had followed nomads across the steppe now followed merchants through the bazaar. But unlike wine, which was explicitly forbidden under Islamic law, hashish existed in a grey area. The Quran condemned drunkenness, but said little about smoke. Scholars debated whether intoxication by scent and thought was the same as intoxication by drink. Theologians wrote treatises against it, while poets wrote verses in its favour. As with all prohibitions, the result was compromise. The public frowned, and the private indulged. It was the mystics, the Sufis, who gave hashish its spiritual meaning. Sufism was less a sect than a way of approaching faith, emphasizing direct personal experience of the divine. For the Sufi, prayer was not enough. One had to feel God, not just obey him. Many found that certain states of awareness, rhythmic chanting, dancing, or quiet contemplation, open the heart to something beyond reason. In this atmosphere, hashish became more than a pastime. It was a key, a way to loosen the boundaries of the self and experience unity with creation. The poet Al-Sarraj wrote of the green herb that grows from the earth and draws the soul upward toward its maker. Whether or not he spoke from experience, his words captured the paradox of the age, a culture that prized reason and law, yet quietly adored transcendence. The authorities did not approve. From Baghdad's jurists to Cairo's governors, edicts against hashish multiplied, and yet the habit endured. Bans were issued in the name of morality, revoked in the name of practicality, and reinstated whenever someone in power needed a distraction from real problems. The pattern became familiar, the same one that would repeat for centuries. Hashish was declared un-Islamic by rulers who, in private, kept their own supply. Public flogging for common users coexisted with luxurious indulgence behind palace walls. When your empire controls half the known world, even prohibition feels optional. In the cities of Persia, hashish found its way into the hands of poets and philosophers. The celebrated polymath Avicenna likely knew of its medicinal uses, though he treated it with caution, warning of its potency. Others were less reserved. The wandering poet Rumi, writing in the 13th century, used the language of intoxication to describe spiritual ecstasy. Whether he spoke of wine, love, or hashish hardly mattered. The metaphor was the same. The mystic's goal was to dissolve the self and merge with the divine. The means were secondary. In that sense, the Sufis' use of hashish was not rebellion, but devotion, a way of inhaling the nearness of God. Hashish also made its way into popular legend. The Arabian Nights, that ever-expanding collection of tales, includes stories of beggars, tricksters, and dreamers who eat the resin and drift into improbable adventures. In these fables, intoxication is never purely vice. It is a gateway to imagination, the substance that allows the ordinary man to glimpse extraordinary things. Of course, not all tales were flattering. Western chroniclers later distorted one legend in particular, the story of a secret sect of assassins who, it was said, used hashish to induce visions of paradise and recruit followers willing to kill in the name of faith. The term hashashin entered European languages as assassin, though historians now doubt the tale's accuracy. Still, the myth survived because it served a purpose. It made a foreign habit sound dangerous and exotic, which is exactly how every empire prefers to view the pleasures of others. In Egypt, hashish spread more democratically. It was the poor man's wine, cheap, portable, and unregulated. Labourers and craftsmen smoked it after long days in the heat, finding in its haze a brief sense of ease. The Sufi orders used it in ceremonies, turning prayer into a gentle rhythm of breath and thought. Poets wrote of its ability to make music sound deeper and conversation more sincere. Meanwhile, the upper classes looked down from their balconies, pretending not to notice the scent that drifted up from the streets. The pattern was ancient. Workers, poets, and mystics embraced what the elite secretly enjoyed but publicly denied. By the 13th century, Cairo had become one of the world's capitals of hashish. Travellers from across the Mediterranean wrote in equal parts wonder and disgust about the city's cafes, where men sat for hours sharing pipes and stories. Government decrees continued to condemn the habit, but the people ignored them. When authorities raided the cafes, new ones appeared within days. When they burned the crops, seeds hidden in traders' saddlebags sprouted again along the Nile. Hashish had become as much a part of daily life as bread or prayer, not because it was permitted, but because it answered a need deeper than law. It is tempting to see hypocrisy in this, but the truth is more complex. The Islamic Golden Age was a civilization of extraordinary intellect and restraint, and it lived constantly in tension between faith and curiosity. Its scientists mapped the stars while its mystics sought to transcend them. Hashish thrived in that tension, a plant that promised both clarity and confusion, depending on who held it. To the theologian, it was a test. To the labourer, relief. To the poet, inspiration. Few substances in history have worn so many masks so convincingly. As trade expanded westward, hashish travelled with it, following the same merchants who carried cotton, glass, and sugar to the ports of Europe. The Islamic world may have seen cannabis as a paradox of spirit and science, but Christian Europe viewed it as something far simpler, raw material. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, hemp became one of the quiet foundations of European agriculture, woven into the daily life of villages and monasteries alike. Fields of it rippled across France, England, and the Low Countries, not as a symbol of ecstasy, but as an emblem of industry. It was planted beside flax and barley, harvested in early autumn, soaked in ponds to loosen its fibres, and beaten until the strands could be spun into rope or woven into coarse cloth. It was hard, wet work. No mysticism, no incense, only the smell of earth and rot and labour. Europe's relationship with cannabis was, in essence, a practical marriage. The plant was too useful to ignore, and too dull, in its fibrous form, to excite the imagination. Hemp provided what Europe needed most: durability. The ropes it produced bound together ships and cathedrals alike. The parchment made from its pulp carried papal decrees, royal charters, and early books. In some regions, families paid taxes in bundles of hemp fibre, its value measured by weight and utility rather than pleasure. This was a continent obsessed with building, with bridges, ships, and bureaucracies, and hemp fit the mood perfectly. It was a plant that promised order and stability, not revelation. Ironically, the very same species that had inspired mystics and poets across Asia was now reduced to the raw mechanics of empire. The psychoactive potential of the plant, so familiar to ancient healers, was largely forgotten or dismissed. European strains were cultivated for their fibre, not their resin, and what small traces of intoxication remained were buried beneath centuries of selective breeding. The plant still had the capacity to alter consciousness, but few Europeans ever gave it the chance. In a society that regarded wine as the acceptable form of altered perception and prayer as the only legitimate transcendence, hemp's subtler effects went unnoticed. Europe ignored the high but adored the rope, a habit that continued in both senses. There were, of course, exceptions. Folk healers and midwives in rural communities sometimes used hemp seeds and oil in poultices or tonics. Records from medieval herbals mention hemp as a treatment for inflammation, burns, or pain of the joints. Occasionally, it was recommended for melancholy or sleeplessness, though always in cautious doses. The Church tolerated these remedies so long as they remained practical, not pleasurable. There was no great tradition of cannabis intoxication in medieval Europe, no festivals of smoke or sacred communion. The few who experimented with it likely kept quiet, not from fear of law. There were few specific prohibitions, but from lack of interest. Compared to the intoxicating wines of France or the ales of England, hemp seemed tame, a tool rather than a temptation. Still, it shaped the texture of daily life. In monasteries, hemp was cultivated in long orderly rows behind stone walls. Monks used its fibres to weave coarse habits and repair fishing nets, its seeds to feed poultry and press oil for lamps. The quiet endurance of the plant mirrored the discipline of monastic routine, patient, repetitive, and useful. Across Europe, it became a symbol of humble labour, a reminder that even the lowliest weed could serve divine order. To the medieval mind, there was something morally reassuring about hemp. It was earthy, honest, and obedient. It did not provoke sin, nor did it tempt the mind toward heresy. Its economic importance grew with Europe's appetite for exploration. As shipbuilding advanced, so did the demand for rope and sailcloth, both of which consumed enormous quantities of hemp. A single vessel required miles of rigging, each strand carefully spun and tarred. In England, royal decrees mandated hemp cultivation to support the navy. The plant's fibres became the literal threads of maritime ambition, linking inland fields to distant oceans. When sailors spoke of setting their sails to catch God's wind, they did so beneath canvases woven from hemp. The contrast could not have been greater. In one world, the plant carried prayers. In the other, it carried trade. Hemp's oil also found its way into homes and workshops. It lit candles, waterproofed leather, and mixed into paints and varnishes that decorated altarpieces and frescoes. Artists like Van Eyck and Giotto, centuries later, would rely on hemp oil's smooth consistency to grind their pigments. In this way, cannabis contributed to European spirituality after all, not through ecstasy, but through infrastructure. The cathedrals that rose toward heaven owed something to the plant that held their scaffolding together and illuminated their icons. The religious culture of the Middle Ages had little patience for substances that blurred consciousness. Ecstasy was permitted only through divine vision, not through chemistry. When mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote of spiritual intoxication, they did so metaphorically, their rapture sanctioned by faith rather than by herb. Any suggestion that a plant could induce similar states would have seemed suspicious, if not heretical. The Church maintained tight control over both physical and spiritual nourishment. Wine at Mass, bread for communion, prayer for transcendence. There was no place in this structure for hemp's subtler gifts. While theologians debated the nature of the soul, farmers continued to harvest hemp by the ton, spinning it into ropes that would eventually carry the gospel to new continents. The same material that tied the rigging of European ships would later bind captives in colonial ports. Hemp's story in Europe is not one of intoxication, but of entanglement. The plant as a servant of empire, its fibres woven into sails that would expand both commerce and conquest. By the 15th century, hemp had become so indispensable that laws compelled farmers to grow it. England's Henry VIII required every landowner to plant a quarter-acre of hemp for every 60 acres of farmland. France and the Netherlands imposed similar mandates. The plant was no longer just useful, it was strategic. It connected the fields of peasants to the ambitions of kings, the labour of the poor to the wealth of nations. Its scent became the background odour of an expanding world, damp, fibrous, and faintly sweet, like the promise of profit disguised as progress. Still, for all its ubiquity, hemp inspired no cult of devotion, no poetry of revelation. It existed in Europe as a material fact, stripped of mystery and meaning. The knowledge of its intoxicating potential, still alive in Asia and the Middle East, seemed to fade from collective memory. What survived was its utility, its dependability, its quiet willingness to serve. Europe's version of cannabis was a creature of discipline rather than delight, the plant tamed, literal, and loyal. And so hemp, not hashish, helped launch the empires that would one day carry its cousin around the globe. By the dawn of the 16th century, hemp's fibres were no longer just binding ships together. They were binding continents. The sails that carried European explorers across the world were woven from the same plant that once hung drying in monastery courtyards. Each creak of rope and snap of canvas was a small testament to hemp's quiet indispensability. Without it, the so-called age of exploration would have been logistically impossible. Ships from Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands relied on hemp rigging, ropes, and caulking to survive the long months at sea. Yet as those ships crossed the Atlantic and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they carried something else along with them: seeds, fibres, and the human habits attached to them. What had once been a local crop of Europe and Asia was about to become a global presence, cultivated, consumed, and reinterpreted in every corner of the colonial world. Portuguese and Spanish sailors were among the first to bring cannabis to new shores. To the empires of the 16th century, hemp was both commodity and companion, a crop to plant in conquered soil and a comfort for the men who did the conquering. Sailors often carried small pouches of the dried leaves and seeds, using them for rope repairs or to smoke in quiet moments between storms. They called it maconha in Portuguese, a term that would later take root in Brazil. The Spanish, meanwhile, introduced hemp to their colonies in the Americas as an agricultural resource, encouraging settlers to cultivate it for fibre while forbidding any intoxicating use. The official line was clear: hemp for rope was honourable, but hemp for the mind was dangerous. The reality, of course, was that no empire could regulate every puff of smoke at sea or every small plot tucked behind a cabin. In Africa, the story became more complicated and more human. Portuguese traders established outposts along the west coast, where they encountered long-standing local traditions of herbal medicine and ritual smoking. Cannabis fit easily into those frameworks. Enslaved Africans carried their knowledge of the plant across the Atlantic, often hidden in memory rather than seed. In Angola and along the Congo River, it was used in spiritual ceremonies and healing rites, believed to connect the living with their ancestors. When those same people were captured and forced aboard slave ships, their customs travelled with them. In the brutal conditions of the Middle Passage and the plantations that followed, cannabis became both solace and quiet resistance, a reminder of agency in a world designed to erase it. As plantation economies spread through the Caribbean and South America, so did the plant's hybrid identity. In the islands, enslaved labourers and indentured servants from India brought with them their own words, ganja, charas, bang, and their own methods of preparation. The Caribbean became a crossroads where African, Indian, and European traditions collided and reshaped one another. Smoking mixtures combined local herbs with imported seeds. Rituals merged song, prayer, and intoxication into something uniquely Creole. On islands like Jamaica, cannabis became part of daily life among the poor and working classes, long before it gained any association with rebellion or religion. It was both a medicine and a marker of survival, a way to soften pain, steady labour, and reclaim a measure of pleasure in a system built on deprivation. In South America, the Portuguese colonies absorbed these same practices under new names. Macona, derived from an African term, became part of Brazilian vernacular culture. Farmers grew the plant quietly in the margins of sugar plantations, using it as both fibre and recreation. Colonial authorities alternated between tolerance and punishment, depending on whether they saw profit or danger in its use. Governors encouraged hemp production for sails and ropes, then turned around and condemned native vices when labourers smoked the same plant. It was the first expression of a hypocrisy that would become global. The state that profits from a cultivation also criminalises enjoyment. European observers documented these contradictions with the usual mix of a fascination and disdain. Missionaries described African and Caribbean cannabis rituals as heathen or primitive, unable to reconcile the sight of devotion expressed through smoke. Colonial physicians, meanwhile, noticed its practical benefits: pain relief, appetite stimulation, reduced anxiety, but rarely admitted as much publicly. It was safer to dismiss local knowledge as superstition while quietly recording its results. In their private journals, some noted that enslaved or indigenous users seemed calmer, more resilient under hardship. Others remarked, with barely concealed envy, on the laughter that echoed from workers' quarters after nightfall. The empires that spread cannabis around the world insisted that they were bringing order, but what they truly distributed was paradox. Every empire exported two things: order and vice. The second always lasted longer. Wherever colonial officials tried to restrict the plant, it adapted. It thrived in neglected soil, sprouting along roadsides, behind kitchens, beside rivers. It needed no permission, no cultivation manuals, no empire to sustain it. The very qualities that made it a perfect fibre, resilience, speed and independence, made it impossible to control. As European powers consolidated their colonial reach, hemp and cannabis became embedded in both the machinery and the margins of empire. In Spain's New World colonies, hemp was grown under royal charter to supply the navy. In British North America, it became one of the first mandated crops. Virginia planters were legally required to produce it for export. Meanwhile, in Africa and the Caribbean, its psychoactive form was quietly thriving among the enslaved and the poor. It was a plant of contradictions, a symbol of power on the ships that enforced empire, and a symbol of endurance in the fields beneath them. By the 18th century, cannabis had become a global citizen. Its seeds had crossed every ocean, its fibres connected continents. It had entered languages, economies, and rituals, adapting to each without losing its identity. To sailors, it was the smell of rigging soaked in salt water. To soldiers, it was a familiar comfort in foreign lands. To enslaved and colonized peoples, it was a medicine of the dispossessed, a way to hold on to fragments of their old worlds. As colonial trade intensified, hemp's industrial role grew even more profitable. The British and Dutch navies depended on it for rope and canvas, while merchants traded it like any other staple crop. Yet behind every ledger entry was a more complex human story, one of forced labour, cultural exchange, and survival through adaptation. When a Portuguese ship left Lisbon with hemp sails and returned months later with barrels of sugar, it completed a circle that bound two uses of the same plant. One mechanical, one human. The first served empire, the second served endurance. The global spread of cannabis during this era was not the result of curiosity or science, but of momentum. The empires did not intend to create a worldwide network of cultivation. They simply could not stop the plant from following them. It rode the same winds as colonial ambition and outlasted it. Every port it touched added a new word, a new use, a new justification for why it mattered. By the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire had reached the height of its confidence, a machine of trade and science polished by moral certainty. It stretched across continents, collecting both resources and curiosities. One of those curiosities came from the east, a dark green resin that smelled faintly of spice and smoke, pressed into blocks and traded in Indian bazaars. To most Englishmen, it was a novelty, a native indulgence like curry or betel nut. But to one Irish physician stationed in Calcutta, it looked like something more. His name was William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, and he would become the man who reintroduced cannabis to Western medicine. O'Shaughnessy arrived in India as both doctor and scientist, part of a generation that saw the colonies as laboratories for discovery. In the 1830s, he began studying local remedies used by Indian physicians, many of which dated back thousands of years. Among them was bhang, the same preparation of crushed cannabis leaves and milk that had been offered to the god Shiva in ancient rituals. O'Shaughnessy noticed its use in treating pain, spasms, and even convulsions. He conducted careful experiments, first on animals, then on patients. In 1839, he published his findings, describing cannabis as a safe and effective treatment for muscle cramps, rheumatism, and even the violent seizures of tetanus. His tone was clinical, but his conclusions were revolutionary. The plant, long dismissed as an exotic vice, had become, through British empiricism, a respectable medicine. Within a decade, cannabis tinctures, alcohol-based extracts, began appearing in apothecaries across Britain. They were sold under names like Extractum Cannabis Indica or Tinctura Cannabis. These were not the casual indulgences of hashish cafes or street vendors. They were medicines in proper glass bottles, corked and labelled, sitting beside laudanum, chloroform, and ether. For patients plagued by pain, insomnia, or anxiety, cannabis promised relief without the dangers of opium addiction. The British press described it as an Eastern sedative for Western nerves. Victorian doctors prescribed it for migraines, menstrual cramps, hysteria, and the restlessness of age. It was particularly popular among women, whose ailments, both physical and emotional, were often treated with tinctures that dulled sensation as much as they cured disease. Queen Victoria herself was rumoured to have used cannabis tincture on the advice of her personal physician, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, to ease the pain of menstrual cramps. Reynolds later wrote that cannabis was one of the most valuable medicines we possess, noting its ability to calm pain without the excitement, delusion, or sickness of other narcotics. Whether the Queen actually partook or not, the association gave the drug a patina of respectability. For a time, cannabis was as proper as chamomile tea, prescribed by doctors, bottled by chemists, and swallowed discreetly by the middle class. Still, there was something uneasy in the arrangement. The Victorians feared sin but adored sedation. They lived in an age that valued self-control, yet depended on chemicals to maintain it. Opium was common in every household. Chloroform was celebrated as a miracle of surgery. Yet each carried the faint scent of moral compromise. Cannabis, by contrast, seemed almost innocent. It was natural, ancient, and, crucially, foreign. Its association with the exotic East gave it a veneer of harmless mystique. Writers and artists experimented with it in pursuit of inspiration, echoing their French counterparts in the Club des Hachishins of Paris. But in Britain, the use was quieter, less theatrical. This was not the ecstasy of poets, but the drowsy relief of the overworked and overworried. For apothecaries, cannabis was simply one item in a growing pharmacological catalogue. Their shelves glistened with amber bottles of morphine, codeine, and cocaine, all legal, all administered in the name of science. But cannabis occupied a special place between curiosity and cure. It was prescribed for everything from toothaches to melancholy, dosed by the drop or teaspoon. Patients described a slow warmth, a softening of pain, and a peculiar expansion of thought. Some wrote of gentle euphoria, others of mild confusion. The results were inconsistent, partly because the medicine itself was. No one had yet standardized cannabis extracts. Potency varied wildly, depending on the batch, the climate, or the chemist's skill. One bottle might soothe a patient into peaceful sleep, while another from the same shop could induce panic or dizziness. This inconsistency would become its undoing. As the century progressed, medicine grew more mechanical, and doctors more cautious. The discovery of microbes, anesthetics, and surgical sterilization shifted medicine toward precision. The old art of prescribing tinctures by intuition gave way to measurement, dosage, and laboratory control. In this new environment, cannabis seemed unreliable, too temperamental, too difficult to quantify. The British Pharmacopoeia included it in its listings, but with increasing reservations. Some doctors claimed it lost potency on long voyages from India. Others complained that Western patients reacted unpredictably. By the 1890s, new synthetic drugs, morphine derivatives, barbiturates, and aspirin promised cleaner, faster results. Moral attitudes hardened as well. The same empire that had imported cannabis as medicine now began to fear its recreational use among colonial subjects. Reports from Egypt and India described soldiers and labourers smoking hashish, sometimes to excess. The British press painted it as a foreign vice, linking it with laziness, madness, and rebellion. The same substance being prescribed in London, drawing rooms, was being condemned in colonial barracks. Yet the contradiction went largely unacknowledged. The empire's moral compass was selective, its fear reserved for those who used pleasure without permission. By the turn of the century, the golden age of cannabis medicine was fading. Chemists still stocked it, but demand dwindled as regulations tightened and newer drugs captured the public imagination. The 1898 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, a massive British study into cannabis use in India, concluded that moderate use was largely harmless. The report's conclusions were calm, even reasonable, but they were quietly ignored by policymakers who preferred the simplicity of prohibition. Respectability had moved on. The apothecary's secret no longer fit the image of modern science. For a while, cannabis lingered in the background, a fading entry in medical manuals, a relic of the age of tinctures and tonics. Bottles gathered dust in chemists' cupboards, their labels yellowed and unread. The plants that had once bridged continents and cultures now seemed to belong to an earlier, less disciplined world. The Victorians had tamed it, bottled it, and eventually forgotten it. What began as an experiment in colonial medicine ended as a footnote in pharmacology. In the early years of the 20th century, cannabis had already lived many lives in the Americas. The Spanish had planted hemp here in the 16th century, raising it for rope and sailcloth, just as they had in Europe. The Portuguese had done the same in Brazil, where enslaved Africans carried the plant's other, older purpose: smoke for the body, calm for the spirit. In the Caribbean, Indian indentured labourers had introduced their word for it, ganja, and their quiet evening rituals of smoke and stillness. For centuries, it lingered in the background of colonial life, a comfort of the enslaved, a medicine of the poor, a crop of the state. But by the early 1900s, it returned to public attention under a new name, a new accent, and a new set of fears. In the borderlands and port cities of the United States, New Orleans, Galveston, Tampa, San Diego, cannabis found another migration route. Mexican labourers brought it north as marijuana, rolling it into cigarettes after long days in the fields. Caribbean sailors carried it ashore as ganja, a small parcel of home folded into their tobacco pouches. For them, it was ordinary, something between a ritual and a relief. But America was changing. Industrial cities were swelling. Immigration was reshaping identity, and the ruling class felt its grip on order slipping. The name itself helped seal its fate. Marijuana was unfamiliar, a word that carried the scent of other languages, other skin tones. Newspapers soon began using it deliberately, choosing the exotic spelling over the simpler cannabis. By the 1910s, headlines warned of marijuana, the Mexican menace, spreading through the Southwest. In New Orleans, where the Mississippi spilled both goods and culture into the Gulf, cannabis found its way into music. Jazz was emerging, syncopated, irreverent, and improvised, and marijuana moved through its circles like a shared secret. Musicians called it muggles, gauge, or simply tea. They said it made time more elastic, the notes stretch and breathe. In the small clubs of Storyville, the air shimmered with brass, laughter, and smoke that curled toward the rafters, like incense in an unholy temple. To the players, it was a tool of focus, a slow rhythm in a world that moved too fast. To their audiences, it was a kind of liberation. To the newspapers, it was corruption. Jazz frightened polite society because it was everything the early 20th century was trying not to be: black, improvisational, and free. The sight of young people dancing to it, white and black together, swaying in the same smoky rooms, struck terror into the hearts of moralists and city officials. Marijuana became part of that anxiety, a convenient scapegoat for music they didn't understand and people they didn't want to acknowledge. The drug, they said, caused mad laughter and savagery. They never mentioned the laughter was relief from poverty and that the savagery was music. As jazz spread north through migration and touring bands, so did marijuana. Chicago, Kansas City, and New York became its new homes, each adding its own rhythm. The Great Migration brought millions of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North, carrying their culture and their vices together. In the Harlem clubs of the 1920s, marijuana mingled with gin, poetry, and saxophones. Writers like Fats Waller and Louis Armstrong spoke about it with amusement rather than shame. Armstrong called it the gauge, saying it made him feel at peace, made the notes talk to one another. His tone was gentle, not rebellious. It was simply part of life. Outside those clubs, though, America was in one of its moral panics. Prohibition had turned alcohol into a national obsession, and law enforcement needed something new to crusade against. Immigrants, jazz, and marijuana fit the bill. Local laws began cropping up across the southern and western states, each one citing a supposed wave of crimes committed under the drug's influence. The evidence was non-existent, but that didn't matter. The headlines were the point. A Mexican drug that turned Negroes into fiends and white women into degenerates was an irresistible story for a nation that measured purity in fear. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, and with it, the old instinct to blame the vulnerable. As jobs vanished and wages collapsed, Mexican migrants became targets of resentment. They were accused of stealing work, spreading disease, and corrupting morals. The same accusations hurled at nearly every immigrant group before and since. Marijuana became part of that mythology, a symbol of an imagined threat. Local police arrested field workers for possession, and newspapers exaggerated each incident into proof of an epidemic. Even the word marijuana became a kind of linguistic weapon, chosen precisely because it didn't sound English. Enter Harry J. Anslinger, a bureaucrat who understood better than anyone how to turn fear into policy. Appointed in 1930 as head of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Anslinger inherited an agency in search of purpose. Alcohol prohibition was crumbling, and he needed a new villain to justify his budget. He found it in marijuana. Gathering a handful of sensational, often fabricated anecdotes, he began circulating them to newspapers and legislators. Marijuana, he claimed, was a killer weed that drove users to murder, insanity, and racial mixing. His quotes read like pulp fiction, but they worked. He found allies in politicians eager for headlines and publishers hungry for scandal. Anslinger's genius was simplicity. He reframed an old, familiar plant as something alien, criminal, and contagious. Every social fear could be pinned to it. The collapse of moral order, the threat of the foreign, the mixing of races. His propaganda machine was relentless. Pamphlets, posters, radio segments, all declaring that marijuana was America's newest menace. This was the same substance Queen Victoria's physician once called a valuable sedative, now presented as the destroyer of youth. Fear, as always, proved easier to sell than fact. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods where the plant actually lived, life went on. Dock workers in New Orleans still passed joints after long shifts. Musicians still rolled them before stepping onto the stage. For them, marijuana was neither exotic nor evil. It was ordinary. The true divide wasn't between users and abstainers, but between those who could use it unseen and those whose very existence was criminalized. The new war on marijuana was not about health or science, it was about control. The propaganda machine reached its absurd peak with the 1936 film Reefer Madness, financed by a church group and later adopted by Anslinger's campaign. The movie told the story of clean-cut teenagers whose first puff of marijuana led them down a spiral of delirium, jazz, manslaughter, and ruin. Its tone was deadly serious, its acting unintentionally comic. Teachers and parents were invited to screenings as part of public education. Few left the theatre enlightened, but many left frightened, which was the point. Facts didn't move public opinion, melodrama did. The message was simple. Marijuana equaled madness, immorality, and murder. A year later, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, transforming hysteria into statute. The act didn't technically outlaw cannabis. That would have required evidence, but it made possession or distribution illegal without a federal stamp that almost no one could obtain. With a few signatures, a plant once sold in Victorian chemist shops became contraband. Doctors stopped prescribing it. Pharmacists cleared their shelves. The nation that had bottled cannabis as medicine now branded it poison. When World War II began, imported fibres dried up, and the Navy needed rope. The same government that had condemned hemp as a vice now called it a virtue. The Department of Agriculture released a short film, Hemp for Victory, in 1942, urging farmers to sow the outlawed crop for the ropes that bind victory. Fields sprouted across the Midwest. Hemp filled the rigging of warships, and patriotic posters praised the very plant the Bureau of Narcotics was still calling evil. When peace returned, the program was buried, the fields burned, and the contradiction politely forgotten. By the 1950s, fear had become policy, and policy had become routine. The Cold War reframed narcotics as moral weakness, a crack in the armour of democracy. Congress passed harsh sentencing laws. 5 years for a first marijuana offence, 10 for the second. Anslinger's bureau expanded steadily, its success measured by arrests and appropriations. The reefer madness of the 1930s had settled into bureaucracy. Paperwork replaced panic, but the purpose was the same: to remind Americans that pleasure without permission was dangerous. Anslinger turned his attention outward, exporting America's anxieties through the new United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs. The United States, still flush with post-war confidence, recast its domestic crusade as global responsibility. Nations that had never regarded cannabis as a problem found themselves pressured to criminalize it, sometimes to qualify for aid or trade. In less than 2 decades, one man's obsession had become international doctrine. The empire of fear had gone multinational. At home, the culture was beginning to slip beyond his grasp. The war had produced a generation disillusioned with authority and fascinated by experience. The beat poets, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, treated marijuana not as menace but as muse. In the bars and basements where jazz kept evolving, musicians spoke of it with easy familiarity. It wasn't rebellion, it was rhythm. Cannabis had survived every effort to bury it and now reappeared, not as scandal but as curiosity. The 1950s were, officially, an age of restraint, conformity, suburban lawns, and televised smiles. Unofficially, they were full of quiet experimentation. Soldiers returning from war had carried their habits home. Students and artists picked them up in small invisible circles. Police still raided and prosecutors still scolded, but each arrest felt a little more anachronistic. The country's anxieties were shifting, from jazz to communism, from reefer to rockets. Marijuana never disappeared, but it no longer held the spotlight of fear. It had become a background hum in the machinery of paranoia. Anslinger's influence lingered, but time was eroding his authority. He had built a career on panic, and panic has a short shelf life. In the early 1960s, he retired, leaving behind a bureaucracy trained to sustain itself without him. His name slipped from headlines, but his shadow stretched across decades of law enforcement and international treaties. The nation no longer needed its old crusader. It had inherited his reflex. At the end of the 1950s, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Cannabis had been outlawed in the name of morality, revived in the name of patriotism, and condemned again in the name of order. It was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, illegal yet indispensable, forgotten yet feared. Meanwhile, writers and musicians quietly reclaimed it, finding in its calm what bureaucracy never could, a small space for thought. By the early 1960s, the world that Harry Anslinger had built was starting to crumble, though the walls had not yet fallen. His crusade had created laws, agencies, and habits of suspicion sturdy enough to outlive him, but the generation coming of age no longer feared the same things. They had grown up under the shadow of nuclear war, televised prosperity, and quiet disillusionment. For them, the question was no longer how to obey, but how to feel alive. Marijuana, long buried under decades of propaganda, returned as both symbol and solace. It was the antithesis of everything the establishment stood for. Natural, in an age of machines, calming in a culture of competition, and defiantly communal in a society built on control. In the coffee houses and communes of the early 1960s, joints passed from hand to hand like a silent vote against conformity. Musicians, artists, and students discovered in marijuana a way to stretch time, to listen rather than rush. It wasn't the drug of escapists, it was the anthem of the curious. When the civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War began to merge with the youth culture that surrounded rock music, the plant became part of the uniform, as recognizable as long hair, denim, and guitars. To smoke was to dissent, to signal that you no longer believed what your parents' generation had told you about progress, decency, or war. The government called it deviance, the users called it peace. The divide became almost theatrical. On one side, a nation that saw law and order as moral absolutes. On the other, a generation that treated freedom as an experiment. Police officers in riot gear faced barefoot marchers singing folk songs through clouds of smoke. The contrast was too perfect for television to resist. Every arrest made for better footage, every crackdown for better headlines. In Washington, politicians spoke of the moral decay spreading through America's youth, while those same youth were being drafted into a war they didn't believe in. Marijuana, harmless though it was, became a vessel for everything the older generation feared: rebellion, race, sex, and laughter. By the late 1960s, the movement was no longer confined to campuses or small circles. It had become visible, noisy, and impossible to ignore. From the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco to the muddy fields of Woodstock, marijuana was as much a part of the scenery as the music. It was the scent of the counterculture, that faint, sweet trace that clung to denim jackets and guitar cases, a signal that the rules no longer applied. It turned strangers into friends and concerts, into communities. For a brief moment, it seemed to stand for something larger than itself, an idea that peace could be lived, not legislated. The establishment called it an epidemic of vice. The users called it enlightenment. But rebellion always smells the same in every century. It's the laws that change flavour. As the counterculture flourished, the state moved to define its limits. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed marijuana in Schedule 2, the government's highest category of danger, alongside heroin and above cocaine. It was classified as having no accepted medical use, as though the last century of apothecaries had never happened. The decision was political theatre, disguised as public health. The Nixon administration's newly declared war on drugs provided the stage. Arrest rates soared, and the distinction between criminal and dissenter blurred overnight. The law became a mirror of the cultural divide, reflecting the anxieties of a nation terrified of losing control. Mandatory sentencing laws followed. In some states, a single marijuana conviction could mean years behind bars. Police departments learned that drug arrests were an easy way to demonstrate success, and marijuana possession, cheap, visible, and racially skewed, offered a steady supply of statistics. The cost was measured not in arrests, but in lives derailed. A generation that spoke of love and freedom discovered that punishment was one of the few American industries that never stopped expanding. By the mid-1970s, the rhetoric of morality had hardened into a system of control. The flower children had made their point, but the handcuffs still clicked shut, and yet the contradictions multiplied. Surveys showed that by the late 1970s, nearly half of young adults in the United States had tried marijuana, while public officials continued to condemn it as a threat to civilization. Politicians who privately admitted to youthful experimentation preached abstinence from podiums. The plant had become so widespread that its enforcement turned arbitrary. Tolerated in suburbs, punished in cities, race and class drew the invisible lines. In poorer neighborhoods, especially Black and Latino ones, marijuana laws were enforced with zeal. In wealthier ones, they were ignored with discretion. Equality under law became a kind of dark joke whispered between court dates. The 1970s briefly offered a glimmer of reason. studies commissioned by state governments concluded that marijuana was less harmful than alcohol or tobacco and recommended decriminalization. A few states followed suit, reducing possession to a minor fine. President Jimmy Carter even voiced cautious support for reform, arguing that penalties should not be harsher than the act itself. For a moment, it seemed as though the fever might break, but as the decade ended, politics shifted again. Rising crime rates and economic stagnation gave conservatives the opportunity to reframe the narrative. Marijuana returned to its role as scapegoat, this time under the glow of televised outrage. The 1980s ushered in a polished revival of the old panic, dressed in sharper suits and broadcast in colour. The Reagan administration declared a new phase of the war on drugs, expanding funding for law enforcement and mandatory sentencing. The slogan, "Just Say No," became a moral commandment, simple enough for schoolchildren to memorize and vague enough for politicians to weaponize. Television dramatized addiction with the same zeal reefer madness once brought to the silver screen. The difference was budget, not substance. Under the surface, marijuana arrests continued to climb, and the same communities targeted in the 1930s found themselves targeted again. Prohibition, like history, had learned to repeat itself with better production values. What had begun as a movement of peace slowly transformed into one of exhaustion. The bright optimism of the 1960s dulled under the fluorescent lights of courtrooms and prisons. The counterculture's laughter turned brittle, its slogans commercialized, its ideals repackaged for nostalgia. The dream of liberation shrank into private acts, a joint on a balcony, a song played quietly in a small apartment, a memory of when rebellion still felt possible. The plant endured, but its meaning fractured. To some, it was still the emblem of freedom. To others, the reason for a record that never disappeared. By the time the 1990s began, the Great Crusades had run out of breath. The posters had faded, the slogans had dulled, and the country had discovered newer fears to replace its older ones. But in hospitals, nursing homes, and private bedrooms, marijuana's story was quietly beginning again. This time, it wasn't rebellion that drew people to the plant. It was necessity. For patients living with cancer, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and chronic pain, marijuana returned not as symbol or sin, but as medicine. The rediscovery started not in government laboratories or academic journals, but in suffering, in people who had exhausted every prescription except this one. Doctors noticed what laws refused to acknowledge. Cancer patients found that marijuana soothed nausea from chemotherapy and revived their appetite. People with epilepsy discovered that it could still their seizures when standard drugs failed. Those with chronic pain or anxiety described something subtler, a quieting of the body that didn't blur the mind. Long before the science caught up, the results were obvious to those who needed them. In California, AIDS patients organized compassion clubs to share cannabis illegally, defending their makeshift dispensaries as acts of mercy. For many, it was less about getting high than getting through another day. Science eventually provided the language that politics lacked. Researchers identified THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, as the compound responsible for cannabis's euphoric and psychoactive effects, and CBD, cannabidiol, as its calming counterpart. Together, they interacted with what scientists named the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors in the human body that regulate mood, pain, appetite, and memory. The discovery was both revolutionary and ironic. After half a century of insisting that the drug had no legitimate purpose, researchers realized that the body was designed to respond to it. The system had been there all along, quietly waiting for the politics to tire. Public opinion began to shift as faces replaced statistics. Veterans with chronic pain, children with epilepsy, cancer patients too frail for another round of morphine. These stories cut through decades of propaganda more effectively than any study could. The conversation moved from morality to empathy. By the mid-1990s, a state once synonymous with counterculture became the starting point for policy change. In 1996, California passed Proposition 215, legalizing marijuana for medical use, the first modern law of its kind in the United States. It was both modest and monumental. Modest because it did not erase federal prohibition, monumental because it admitted that the government had been wrong. Other states followed, one hesitant law at a time, until the momentum became irreversible. The turn of the millennium brought more than new laws. It brought normalization. Dispensaries emerged first as cautious storefronts behind tinted glass, then as brightly lit shops that could have passed for coffee houses or pharmacies. The modern marijuana dispensary had little in common with the incense-filled haze of the 1960s or the hushed apothecaries of the 1800s. Behind glass counters sat uniformed clerks with laminated badges explaining dosage, strain, and effect in the language of consumer choice, where shamans once burned leaves in ritual and doctors once mixed tinctures in amber bottles. There were now barcodes and tax receipts. The plant had finally been domesticated by bureaucracy. After 80 years of moral panic, marijuana was legalized with paperwork, the most bureaucratic high imaginable. Legalization spread unevenly, but steadily. In Canada, the federal government legalized medical marijuana in 2001 and full recreational use in 2018, transforming a century of prohibition into a national industry. Uruguay, the first country to legalize cannabis outright in 2013, treated it as a public health measure rather than a moral debate. The United States, ever federal in its contradictions, evolved piecemeal. Colorado and Washington opened their markets in 2012, followed by dozens of other states. Dispensaries multiplied, revenue soared, and tax incentives turned reluctant politicians into advocates. The same governments that once spent millions on eradication now debated the best way to regulate the harvest. The war had ended not with surrender, but with receipts. As legality spread, the language surrounding cannabis changed again. What was once contraband became product. Strains that had once been whispered about, Sour Diesel, Blue Dream, Northern Lights, now appeared on glossy menus beside descriptions of flavour and effect. Marketing departments replaced mystics. Packaging turned sleek, minimalist, and respectable. Cannabis was branded as wellness, as lifestyle, as luxury. The plant that had once symbolised rebellion was now sold beside artisanal teas and organic skincare. What had been sacred and forbidden had become curated and taxed. Even the smell changed, filtered and packaged to fit suburban comfort. Not everyone celebrated this new respectability. Some long-time users mourned the loss of the plant's intimacy, its connection to the margins, to ritual, to necessity. The sacred herb of India, the rope of empire, the outlaw's comfort, had been repackaged as a boutique commodity. Legalization had freed the plant, but in doing so, tamed it. The new dispensaries offered safety and consistency, but not mystery. The exchange was civil, efficient, and faintly joyless. What had once been shared under stars or whispered across generations was now purchased under fluorescent light. Still, progress was progress. Patients no longer feared arrest for seeking relief. Doctors could discuss cannabis openly without risking their licenses. Researchers finally studied what prohibition had long forbidden. Scientists found evidence that cannabinoids could ease chronic pain, reduce inflammation, and stimulate appetite for patients with wasting illnesses. Trials explored its potential to treat PTSD, multiple sclerosis, and even Alzheimer's disease. Each new discovery quietly mocked the decades spent pretending the plant had no purpose. The same society that once burned fields and jailed users now funded laboratories to rediscover what healers and mystics had known all along. Economics completed what empathy began. Legal marijuana became one of the fastest growing industries in the world, worth tens of billions annually. Tax revenues poured into public coffers, once spent on punishment. States built schools and roads with the profits of what was once contraband. Venture capitalists replaced smugglers, and agricultural engineers replaced underground growers. The black market didn't vanish, but it adapted. Cheaper, leaner, surviving as the plant always had, in the cracks of every system meant to contain it. The global stigma softened but never fully disappeared. Some countries embraced reform, others clung to old fears. In parts of Asia and the Middle East, possession still carried harsh sentences, even death. The same plant that generated tax income in Colorado could still cost a man his life in Jakarta. The uneven geography of legalization revealed the persistence of history's oldest reflex, the need to control what brings comfort. But the tide had turned too far to reverse completely. The conversation was no longer about panic, but policy. Not about sin, but structure. By the 2020s, marijuana has become an ordinary feature of modern life. A crop, a business, a medicine, a topic for investment newsletters. The plant's mythology has come full circle, ancient and modern, sacred and regulated, feared and profitable. The pendulum that had swung from ritual to rebellion now rests in bureaucracy. Laws have changed, attitudes have softened, but the plant itself remains what it always was: green, fragrant, unassuming, waiting to be interpreted anew. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story, a journey through 5,000 years of smoke, soil, and memory. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.